And here they are. Well, let's see. Bachelor number one is a successful photographer who got his start when his father found him in the dark room at the age of 13, fully developed. Between takes, he might find him skydiving or motorcycling. Please welcome Rodney Alcala. Rod, welcome.
It's the guy standing in front of you in line at Starbucks and you'd never know. That's what real serial killers are.
We've gone through a lot of hell because of that animal.
Alcala may be the most dangerous of all of the killers that have ever been caught.
He struck again over the weekend, the killer's sixth victim.
I don't know if you've ever lost a child, but there's nothing that hurts like that. Nothing.
Police say they are nowhere near solving the case.
This is a guy who murdered 100 people, and he did it in the most sadistic, horrific ways you can imagine.
If he would do that to a little 8-year-old girl, there's no telling what he would do.
Come on, over here.
The story about the discovery of the body of a millionaire's daughter.
Where did you meet Ellen on the 15th? I think you call like Rocky Raw. Yeah, that was it.
I want to live one day longer than him.
We'll never know how many women are lucky, because every woman that crossed that guy's path was a potential victim.
Do you reckon anyone cares that I'm recording this through a lethal bout of man flu and might subscribe in sympathy? No? Okay. I honestly only took a look at this case because there's an upcoming movie on Netflix about it, and honestly wasn't that interested in jumping in. But by the time I had read literally the Wikipedia page about it, I knew I had to make this video. This story is insane at a first glance, but after diving into it deeply for the past few weeks and really trying to figure out who the victims are and who this monster was, I can honestly say it's not what I was expecting. This is a far more interesting and tragic case than I thought at first glance, and the man at the center of it is more of a monster than I could have even imagined going into this. And a lot of this case centers around one family who has really just been dragged through the mud repeatedly over the course of 4 to 5 decades. And that is the family of Robin Samsoe.
Robin was sweet. I don't think there was anybody that ever said a bad thing about her.
Robin Samsoe was a 12-year-old, blonde, blue-eyed poster child for athleticism and healthy lifestyle.
Robin was the baby of the family. Her brothers, sisters, and mother all doted over Robin.
She always had a spirit about her. I mean, everybody that met her fell in love with her. I'm Robin's oldest sister. We are 2 of 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls.
Everybody could be complaining about being bored, and me and Robin would find ourselves doing cartwheels and back walkovers.
She loved ballet, she loved dancing, she loved gymnastics.
She was the glue to the family.
She was my best friend.
She was probably the most loving child a mother could have. Everything she did to please me. I loved her warmth.
Sadly, on what would otherwise have been just another fun day with friends, Robin Samsoe came across a monster.
Huntington Beach in 1979 in June was chock full of kids and sunbathers and rollerbladers and people walking on boardwalks and just having fun.
You felt safe. She arrived at my house at about, I want to say 11. How much fun can we have during that time? And then I had a great idea. Let's go down to the beach. and have a cartwheel competition.
When Robin and I crossed 14th Street, he spotted us.
Rodney Alcala winds up on the beach talking to Bridget Wilbert and Robin Sampson.
I could definitely see a gentleman with dark hair. I mean, he honed in on us like a shark in the water honing in on a seal.
He approached Robin and her friend, who was also 12 years old. They were sunbathing on Huntington Beach right before Robin's ballet lesson. And he said, hey, I'm in a photography contest.
You're beautiful, you could be a model. How about you let me take pictures?
And he goes, can I take your girls' pictures? I'm, in a photography class or for a photo contest. And Robin goes, sure. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, pops up Jackie Young, my neighbor.
And he reached out and put his hand on Robin's leg. And I was having none of it. I was like, no.
She goes, Bridget, is everything okay? Are you girls all right? And man, he took that camera, turned his head down.
So one of the moms comes over and is like, who are you? Why are you talking to him? And he scurries off.
And you could almost see like smoke coming off his dress shoes. He was gone.
He supposedly left, but obviously he didn't because he followed Robin. Robin had to go to her classes. So she left the beach and she borrowed Bridget's bike to go to class so she wouldn't be late.
This photographer was a suspect right away because 45 minutes later, Robin disappeared and was never seen again.
Shortly after that encounter with that strange photographer, Robin Samsoe would go missing. And now we all know why.
And that's the day she was taken.
Robin had to be at a dance class at 4 o'clock, so she and Bridget went back to Bridget's house.
And Robin had thrown her beach towel and everything into her bag, and she's like, well, I'm gonna get going.
It was time for Robin to be going because she needed to be in the ballet studio to answer phones. That was how she paid for her ballet.
And I go, well, take my bike. Take my bike. It's right downstairs. Take my bike and don't stop.
That was the last time anyone saw Robin.
Robin's ballet teacher called when she did not arrive for her lesson later that day.
And then my house phone rang, and it was one of Robin's brothers. And he said, is Robin still with you? Has she left? Because she hasn't shown up to ballet.
And there's not a sign of anything. No bike, no person on the side of the road, nothing.
Mom began to worry, and still an hour or so later when Robin still hadn't returned.
And I called the police and told them, I said, my daughter's missing. And they told me that they couldn't take a report for 24 hours. So by the next morning, they declared it a kidnapping.
She was supposed to be home 4:35 from her lesson. We spent the next, I did anyway, hours and hours riding up and down the path.
You're on your bicycle?
Mm-hmm.
Looking for your sister?
For hours and hours.
It was probably the most horrifying time of all, not knowing.
And I said, I go, it was that man that took our picture.
He's in his car. He had maps to Southern California. He had blacked out windows. He had this rolling trap to try to get people in it.
Somewhere between leaving her house, Rodney saw her, almost certainly followed her, got her to get into the car, and she'd seen him from the beach, offered to give her a ride.
I'd only been with the city of Huntington Beach for a year. We go to briefings in the morning and they give us any crimes that have occurred during the evening that we should be on the lookout for. And that morning, on the 21st, they told us of Robin's disappearance. As patrol officers, we began scouring the alleys and behind grocery stores and shopping centers looking to see if the bicycle had been discarded. For probably the next 2 weeks, the alleys and behind shopping centers were probably some of the safest places because even though they'd been checked at 10 o'clock in the morning, somebody was probably driving by at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Everybody wanted to find that bicycle.
That was my mom's baby, and my mom cried every day.
Thankfully, Robin's friend Bridget was there the entire time, and the man had left an indelible mark on her young memory, and she was able to remember key details about the man in order to allow the police to create a sketch and put a name to that monstrous face.
This was an extreme rarity in Huntington Beach. It was a bedroom community, quite quiet and peaceful. We get literally hundreds of thousands of people coming to our beach annually. They put out a press release and they talked to one of Robin's friends that she was with the day before and obtained a composite of a person that had been taking photographs of them at the beach.
I really was the only person that could tell you the exact color of his eyes, the height of his cheekbones, the color of his skin, just every detail.
His parole officer saw that and called the detectives.
Who says, hey, I've got a parolee who looks awfully similar to that composite sketch. You need to look at him. His name is Rodney Alcala.
Rodney Alcala is an interesting serial killer as serial killers go, because normally there is some sort of triggering factor or something about their life that you can point to as the key reason, the starting proponent behind all of it. But with Rodney Alcala, it's very different. His life doesn't seem to have that key moment.
Rodney Alcala was born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Bucor in San Antonio, Texas.
He was raised by his mom. He grew up in a clean house. He wasn't abused by anyone.
Everyone who knew him said he was a kind boy, a respectful boy, and highly intelligent.
He was on the surface, a perfectly normal boy. Didn't kill small animals or do any of those other horrible things that serial killers tend to go on to do.
Rodney Alcala had every advantage that somebody could have in life. He had a mother who loved him, which is a big deal psychologically. He had friends. He had brothers and sisters who all turned out to be very successful.
He mostly attends Catholic schools. He's bilingual and he excels academically. An IQ test measures his intelligence at over 140. That's nearly genius level.
But in 1951, when he was 8, his grandmother, who was ill, decided that she wanted to go back to die in Mexico. And so the whole family left Texas and went to Mexico.
His family lived in Mexico for a while.
The grandma passed away.
The father abandons the family at that point in time and then goes back to live in the US. I think that Alcala's relationship with his father was quite an important one to him.
He ended up moving to Los Angeles area, to Monterey Park.
His older brother was already at West Point. So this is a pretty, patriotic family.
He's popular. He's on the yearbook committee. He plays the piano. He runs for the school. He has girlfriends. He's on the surface an all-American or all-Mexican-American boy.
Alcala graduated from UCLA in 1968 with a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree, and he was an honor student.
He's one of these guys that really had every advantage. He had a girlfriend. He was a cross-country letterman. He was on the yearbook committee. It's kind of your all-American boy.
And then he joined the Army in the early 60s, and that's where the trouble really began for Rodney Alcala.
2 years into Alcala's stint in the U.S. Army, his mother's cooking dinner one night, and she looks up, and there's Rodney. Rodney had always been an intelligent, polite young man, and so this wasn't normal behavior to him. He'd never been in trouble before. A military psychiatrist evaluated Rodney and found that he had a strong antisocial personality disorder.
His commanding officer wrote a review of Rodney Alcala that was prophetic.
As it turns out, this bright, handsome young man with the promising future had nightmarish urges that he refused to ignore.
This is a selfish man who manipulates others, who's only driven by his own need, his own personal gain. He really kind of laid out the psychology of Rodney Alcala very early.
So 1963, he gets a pass in the military. He ultimately goes to New York. While in New York, he assaults a girl. He hits her over the head with a Coke bottle. That girl was able to run away.
The military felt that he had had a nervous breakdown. That was their analysis of it. The psychiatrists at the hospital felt it was a lot more serious than that. But he was discharged honorably and not a blemish on his record.
So he ends up coming back to California, where he enrolls in the UCLA Fine Arts program as a photography major.
Rodney Alcala had a genius-level, documented Mensa IQ.
Beth was 22 when she met Alcala in the spring of 1979.
What did you think of his photography work?
I saw a lot of pictures of girls, and that didn't bother me at all.
Young girls?
Young girls, I'd say probably from 12, 13 to probably about 30s.
12 days after the disappearance of Robin Samsoe, the police made a tragic discovery.
Approximately 12 days after Robin went missing, a park ranger in the Sierra Madres at a location called Chantry Flats located some human remains. During their search of the area, they also found a shoe that was identified as belonging to Robin and a beach towel.
This is pretty much the exact spot where Robin Samsoe's remains were located.
There's virtually nothing left of her by the time she was actually found.
I remember I was laying on the couch and the doorbell rang, and I answered the door, and it was the police.
And Sergeant Jenkins came in and he said, we found Robin. I said, I grabbed my purse. I said, okay, let's go. He says, where do you think you're going? I said, go see Robin. He said, we can't do that. I said, that's my baby. Of course I can see her. Why not? He said, because it took us 3 days to identify her. And I got angry. I got so mad. I said, 3 days? I said, how many little girls with long blonde hair disappear in California that took you 3 days? He shook my shoulders, and the tears were coming down his face too. He says, there was no hair.
And there were 12 days for the animals to scavenge Robin's remains. By the time the fire crew actually found her body, she was just bones.
Nobody could understand that somebody could actually do something like this.
My mom she was never the same. It's like her life just had this big empty hole, and everybody else was just on the outside looking in.
There's nothing that hurts like that. Nothing.
It turns to a homicide investigation immediately.
Alcala had actually already been arrested before the body was found on July 24th, only 4 or 5 days after he had met Robin on the beach. Police basically immediately got a tip of who it was from the sketch that Bridget had given, thanks to the parole officer calling them. And this led them to already have him in custody by the time they had found the body, and finding the body simply allowed them to essentially press forward with charges, because pressing forward with murder charges without having a body can be quite difficult from a legal standpoint.
They learned that he had no alibi, that nobody could account for his whereabouts at the time.
He was the perfect suspect. Rodney Alcala was arrested on July 24th and charged with the kidnap and murder of Robin Samsoe.
Bail is set at $250,000, which is too high for his mother to pay.
The worst part, though, of this entire story, and the worst part of the loss of Robin Samsoe's life, even more tragic than just the loss of life itself, is the fact that all of this was completely and utterly avoidable.
As a prosecutor, we prosecute a lot of bad actors, people who do a lot of bad things. I don't think that all criminals are evil, but this man is evil.
Rodney Alcala and people like him are the reason why you can't send your kids walking to school alone.
Tally Shapiro was an 8-year-old little girl who lived at Chateau Marmont, which is a famous hotel in California.
Her father was a music industry executive. She had a mother and a sister and a brother. And they were living there because their house had gone on fire, and they were staying there temporarily.
My name is Tally Shapiro. I'm one of Rodney Alcala's first victims and one of the only living victims.
Tally Shapiro was a young, pretty girl living in Hollywood with her parents. She was going to public school.
I remember the morning was nice and warm because I wore the dress that my nanny had crocheted for me. And I was supposed to take the public bus to school because it was only blocks away. But I didn't like taking the public bus by myself. Car approaches me, and I guess, asked if I needed a ride to school. So he had his window down. I'm on the sidewalk, and I'm talking him through the passenger window.
And she says, my parents told me never to accept rides from strangers.
Tally Shapiro knew she shouldn't talk to strangers, but unfortunately, Rodney tricked her.
And he said, it's okay, I know your parents.
And he says, I'm not a stranger, I know your parents.
Which is totally possible. There were so many people in and out of my house. My father was in the music business, so we had a lot of colorful characters in and out of our house. I got in the car. That's when he asked what time my school started. And then that's when he realized we had plenty of time and he was going to swing by and show me a poster.
He kidnaps her. A good Samaritan sees her get into his car, and it doesn't look right.
In 1968, I was a sales representative, and I drove a lot. That day, I drove up to Hollywood, and I was going along Wilshire Boulevard. I wanted to turn around, but there was a car in the crosswalk. Inside was a man, and he was talking to a young girl, evidently on her way to school, and he was smiling and talking to her, just fixated on this little girl. That disturbed me. All the warning signs were there.
I followed him in, and that's all I remember. He obviously hit me over the head right after that, so that was it.
I thought, what the hell do I do now? He may have a gun, who knows? And so I thought, well, I'll go find the payphone and I'll phone the police.
I was driving down Sunset heading toward West Hollywood when I received a call to go see a man about a possible kidnapping. I went to the front door and started knocking. I could hear someone running around.
Rodney shows up naked and says, hey, I'll be right with you.
I will always remember that face at that door. Very evil face. And he says, I'm in the shower, I got to get dressed. I said, I need to talk to you, please open the door. I put my ear to the door and I'm hearing moaning. Within seconds, I kicked in the door. To the right was a dining room, to the left was a living room, and straight ahead was a kitchen. And here was this little girl. The image will be with me forever. We could see in the kitchen that there was a body on the floor, a lot of blood.
And the police officer, of course, that responded had a choice between save the little girl or catch the bad guy running out the back door. And he saved the little girl.
She was gagging and trying to breathe. And I thought, one for the good guys. She's going to make it. We started searching the residence.
Obviously, this is not a whodunit. We know this is his place. We've got all of his stuff.
There was a lot of photograph equipment, and all of us were amazed at the amount of photographs that he had there of young girls, very young girls. I found his ID. We determined he was a student at UCLA in the photography department.
Rodney had vanished, so police started an exhaustive investigation.
We're shaking doors and checking all last known addresses, and he's just disappeared. He's vanished. Talked to one of his professors at UCLA, and the professor says, you got the wrong man. He says, Alcala was one of my best students. He wouldn't hurt a fly.
We had to find this Rodney Alcala. We had to get him off the street, because if he would do that to a little 8-year-old girl, there's no telling what he would do.
She was in a coma for 32 days. Nobody thought that she would survive, and miraculously, she pulled through.
She was able to get back on her feet after several months in the hospital. And her parents had just had enough. They could not stay in California another minute.
I found out that they had moved to Mexico. The father wanted to give her a better, safer environment to live in. That they did not want to raise the daughter in the society any longer.
And that's where they stayed for the next many years.
My parents never spoke about any of this, and neither did anyone else. I'm so grateful my parents did not have me testify. None of this was my knowledge, and I didn't need to know about those things. It would have totally messed up my childhood.
And given all of that took place in Rodney's apartment, linking him directly to the crime, he knew that the jig would essentially be up and decided to flee California as quickly as possible.
So Rodney Alcala is actually attending UCLA and living less than a mile away from Chateau Marmont when he attacks Tally Shapiro and then seems to vanish.
With Alcala in the wind, former detective Steve Hodel was grasping at thin air.
All kinds of rumors. He'd gone to Mexico, he'd gone to Canada, he'd gone to Europe. I was pretty much convinced he'd gone to Mexico because he had relatives in Mexico. But we kept coming up empty. Back then, we didn't have a lot of the forensics you have today. And we went to the FBI. We said, this guy is going to commit other crimes. He's not going to stop. We've got to find this guy. We've got to get him off the streets. We've got to bring him to justice.
He does not hang around. He decides to leave Los Angeles.
He crisscrossed the country, West Coast, East Coast, West Coast, crossed through a lot of states, and I'm sure there are victims in those states.
Rodney Alcala, after raping and almost killing Tally Shapiro, he fled to New York. He made friends, he charmed people, he got into NYU film school.
Under the name of John Berger.
This is quite a cunning way of both avoiding detection and of starting to build up these new personas, these new characters.
So it's been 3 years now since the rape of Tally Shapiro. The FBI eventually became interested in the case and put Rodney Alcala on the 10 most wanted list.
He changed his identity relatively quickly and found it quite easy to blend in. The thing about New York is it's a big melting pot of a city, high density, and it's easy, especially in a time pre-computer and pre-cameras, every street corner, for someone like him to blend in, especially when you're a charismatic manipulator type of a person with a high IQ.
So New York in the early 70s is certainly, from the civic standpoint, rather challenged. It's Mayor Lindsay's second term. He's having a hard time delivering services to people. Crime is certainly up, violent crime.
Alcala was a monster, but a monster with a pretty face and a nice smile and charm and intelligence.
So in 1968, John Berger walks into NYU and applies to their School of the Arts. So there he was in New York, a fugitive, now for 3 years.
What better place to be a sexual predator than go to a feeding frenzy like New York?
One of his professors was Roman Polanski, who had just directed Rosemary's Baby. In a tragic twist, Roman Polanski would lose his wife, Sharon Tate, and their unborn child the very next year at the hands of followers of Charles Manson.
Even worse than all of this, though, Rodney Alcala actually managed to get himself a job in a camp, a summer camp for children and young women. But there's an upside. Thankfully, this led to his capture in the Shapiro case.
He landed a job as a counselor at an arts and drama camp for girls.
While still enrolled as a student at NYU, Rodney Alcala, a.k.a. John Berger, actually spent his summers as a counselor at an arts camp in New Hampshire.
Here's a guy who's on the run for raping and beating an 8-year-old child. And now he's got a job working with children. That's messed up.
So in August of 1971, two campers take the little dirt road down to the post office, and all of a sudden it starts pouring. They run inside the post office to get cover.
And they're looking at the FBI wanted posters.
And there was Rodney Alcala's photo on the FBI 10 most wanted list, and they looked up and said, oh my gosh, that's Mr. Berger.
So they go back to the camp and they tell the head counselor. So he said, don't say anything to anyone, and I'll go down to the post office and take a look. So he comes back, calls the FBI.
They arrest him, take him into custody. So I get a phone call, and it's the FBI in New Hampshire. Say, hey, we've got your guy in custody, Rodney James Alcala. I said, you got him in custody. Fantastic. He's pretty quiet the whole flight, but he's still putting on this charming demeanor, as if he doesn't have a care in the world. This is all a big mistake. This guy is smooth, calm, collected. I asked him, so tell me about the Tally Shapiro incident. And basically he says, I want to forget all about that. I don't want to talk about things that Rod Alcala did, as if it was a different person. And I had some information about he was dating the owner of the camp's teenage daughter.
Tally Shapiro's family had relocated down to Mexico, so I think that created some logistical problems for the DA back then.
When the prosecution learned that this 8-year-old girl would not be availed to testify, they decided to give him what is known as a plea deal.
In 1972, Rodney Alcala pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of child molestation.
In the investigation for the Samso case in 1979, police would slowly start to unravel just what a monster they were dealing with. And they would come across a haul of evidence that would show them that, and really show not only the families and the police, but the public, the world, what kind of animal they were dealing with here.
They arrest Rodney Alcala, his mother's house in Monterey Park.
So we're going to treat this as a homicide now. And he becomes a prime suspect.
Every one of those detectives was sure that they had the right guy.
They bring him to Huntington Beach, and they interview him.
They asked him, when you ever go to the beach and take photos? And he said, well, from time to time he would do that. And they said, any pictures of people? And Rodney Alcala kind of looked up and he said, not that I recall.
Can you show around
After the police interview him, he's very savvy and he gives up very little information, and he essentially denies all wrongdoing.
He essentially told the police that he hadn't been to Huntington Beach since 1974.
They obtained a search warrant for his mother's residence where he was living.
They don't find any forensic evidence linking Rodney Alcala to the murder of Robin Samso, but they do find a receipt for a storage unit in Seattle.
So in really good heads-up police work, paperwork is not a part of the search warrant, so they cannot collect it. But it's in plain sight, so they write down the information.
They transported Alcala to Huntington PD, and his sister came down.
Police are monitoring Rodney Alcala's communication with his sister.
And he was caught on tape telling her, hey, you got to get it to my storage locker and empty it.
Police learned Alcala had rented the storage facility and moved his belongings there 9 days after Robin Samso's remains were discovered.
They found over 1,000 pictures of young girls and boys that were in explicit and sexually provocative poses, and a lot of them were naked.
Potential victims that Rodney may have targeted, and recover many rolls of undeveloped film.
Hundreds, if not thousands, of these different images, and there are dozens upon dozens of these young women that in the pictures clearly are in positions of supreme vulnerability.
They found no photos of Robin or Bridget, but shots of this young girl roller skating along a familiar boardwalk caught their eye.
A picture of a girl on roller skates, she was 16, named Lori Wirtz, and it came back, she was connected to the day that Robin Samso disappeared.
This girl, she ran over to my front door. She said, Lori, you're on the front page of the paper. They're looking for you.
On June 20th, 1979, Rodney Alcala leaves his mother's house and drives to Huntington Beach.
We were approached by Alcala.
And he says, I'm a photographer, and hey, if you could just, skate this way, I'll take some photos, which really played into his method of luring these women and young girls into vulnerable positions.
My friend Patty and I were at Sunset Beach. We just saw this man with a big camera and telling us that he was in a contest. And, I thought, well, shoot, I'll be in a magazine. That'll be cool. He was asking me all kinds of questions, like where I'm from, my name, my age. He tried really hard to get me in the car.
She doesn't bite, won't get in his car.
He started to drive away, and I did see that he was driving toward Huntington Beach.
That was the same day, about 2 miles away from where Robin Samso was kidnapped. So that photograph was of incredible importance.
The encounter with Lori Wirtz is very important for two different reasons. Number one, it shows that he's actually down in Huntington Beach that day, which he later denies.
We found a guy in the Navy that from the posts in the background, like the signposts, the shadows from the signposts, we were able to actually get, it's like a sundial. And this expert was able to give us the exact time that photo was taken because the signs were still there.
And it also shows that he's actively hunting for his next victim.
Buried under all this stuff was this tiny little silk bag filled with earrings.
And little keepsakes, those are trophies.
For Rodney, it's his vehicle for power and control. That's why he keeps things.
I remember them asking my mom to the police department to come and identify some things that they found at a locker in Washington.
2 of the earrings found were gold ball earrings. Robin was described as wearing those earrings on the day that she disappeared.
Police now had enough, and the district attorney's office had more than enough to bring this to trial and were confident in getting a conviction. And therefore, in 1980, Rodney Alcala, Robin Samso's killer, went on trial.
In February 1980, nearly 1 year after Robin Samso's murder, Rodney Alcala went on trial.
The name, Rodney Alcala. What does that name mean to you today?
It means evil, it means horror, it means pain, and a lot of anger.
He asked you if you brought a gun to court, and you answered?
Yes, I did.
Were you going to shoot him?
I was going to shoot him right between the eyes if I could have gotten a shot at him.
Her plan was to shoot Alcala. She wanted to avenge her daughter.
What stopped you?
Robin's hand on my wrist. If the truth be known. All of a sudden, I smelled her shampoo. And I felt this warmth in my hand, and I couldn't get my hand out of my purse.
Within 24 hours of the release of that composite, which looks exactly like him, he made arrangements to cut his hair.
Totally different. The long, curly hair was gone.
Around the same time, Alcala had also changed the carpeting in the back of his car.
So at that point, those are all the nuts and bolts that you need for a successful prosecution. Over the course of 2.5 months, there were almost 50 witnesses that testified. It was a very long, very difficult case. The more they learned about Rodney Alcala, the more perfectly Rodney Alcala fit into the profile, essentially, of the person that they were looking for.
Given all of the evidence and everything the jury heard throughout this trial, they made a pretty swift decision on this one. It wasn't hard for them to decide where the hammer should fall.
On May 8th, 1980, the jury on the Robin Samso case deliberated less than 5 hours.
The jury convicted Alcala and sentenced him to death.
It's a poor exchange for my daughter's life, but maybe it'll save someone else's by him being gone.
He was taken to San Quentin, where he was put on death row.
And that should have been the end of the story. But sadly, for the Samso family, this ordeal was far from over.
Several years later, an appeal came up. And to everyone's shock and sorrow and horror, the case was repealed.
Today, in a 5-1 decision, the California State Supreme Court ruled that Rodney Alcala did not receive a fair trial.
I think that there's been a gross miscarriage of justice for being found guilty of something that I didn't do, and I think the case will be reversed on appeal.
Will Rodney Alcala ever be put to death in your estimation? Not if I can have anything to do with it.
Just can't believe that we have to be punished for what he did. And that's really what it amounts to. He's got nothing to do but gain. All we have to do is be destroyed and be pulled down a little bit further. I don't know if we can. We're the ones that are being punished. It means nothing to him.
The verdict was overturned by the California Supreme Court because the justices determined that the jurors had been improperly informed of Alcala's prior sex crimes.
Once again, my mother was completely destroyed.
There's only one perpetrator, that little stone, but the ripples keep going. He killed my child,
The more and more you learn about this case, the more frustrating it becomes. And I think the crux of that is when you realize that all of this tragedy and the rest of the tragedy to come could have been avoided years earlier if the system had have just worked and not failed the victims in this case. All of this could have and should have been avoided.
Rodney Alcala is charged with all the crimes against Telly Shapiro, which included kidnapping, rape, child molestation, and torture.
It turns out that because Tally and her family were in Mexico, the only charge they could put on him was a plea deal.
But he ultimately was convicted of child molest. He received 1 year to life back in the old indeterminate sentencing laws.
This meant that Rodney Alcala would have yearly parole reviews.
He was able to read people very well and stay a step or two or three ahead of them. For him, it was all a kind of a chess game.
In 1974, after less than 3 years in prison, a psychiatrist evaluates Rodney Alcala and finds him to be significantly improved.
After only 34 months in state prison, the parole board released this man into the wild, into society.
I was flabbergasted, to say the least. It just amazed me.
They could have kept him in for life, but after 2.5 years, a psychologist said that he no longer posed a danger to women or children.
The emphasis was on rehabilitation back then, and he was able to charm the psychiatrist just like he charmed his victims.
So he's released after 34 months for beating and raping an 8-year-old girl.
Looking at that now, in retrospect, I don't know what they were thinking, but by releasing Rodney Alcala, it resulted in literally probably dozens of people losing their lives in the most horrific way.
So the system had already failed once. Rodney Alcala, after beating, raping, and almost murdering an 8-year-old child who was lucky to survive, was back out on the streets hunting for his next victim. Thankfully, they would get a second chance to right this wrong.
So Alcala is the luckiest man in the world. He's out on parole, and he's having the best time. He's photographing people.
He was hired by the Los Angeles Times to work as a typesetter. He took photos at weddings, and he was a registered sex offender during all of that, and nobody ever checked.
And he one day decides to take a ride, and he starts trolling again.
He kidnaps a 13-year-old and provides her with marijuana.
So he gets arrested yet again.
And he's convicted of breaking his parole and selling drugs to a minor. He goes back to jail.
And this time, he gets 2.5 years, and he's taken to prison.
In June 1977, Rodney Alcala is released again from California State Prison, and he goes in, different parole officer this time, and he asks for permission to go on some vacations.
And the parole officer miraculously says, sure, go ahead. So Rodney heads off to New York.
There's a huge lesson here on Rodney Alcala because people are starting to do this again. California the pendulum is swinging back towards early release, towards therapy for these guys, all that sort of thing. People like Rodney Alcala, when they get out, they're going to kill other people.
So once again, the system had failed. And that system didn't only fail Robin Samsoe, it has failed many families, which the police would only discover later on. Shortly after, the police in the Samsoe case in 1979 took that call from the parole officer identifying the sketch, something would happen, something insane would happen in this that would give this case and this killer his moniker.
And like 15 minutes after they received that phone call, one of the cops is home, turns on the TV, and sees Alcala on the dating game.
Bachelor number one is a successful photographer. Please welcome Rodney Alcala.
Bachelor number one is a serial killer, it turns out, and he had already had a violent record when this episode aired.
The premise was the female asking questions of 3 bachelors who sat on the other side of a partition.
And she'd pick someone to go on a date with at the end of the dating game.
He was, in game show fashion, charming, funny, and suggestive when he acted like just another guy.
We're going to have a great time together, Cheryl.
Most serial killers, or killers in general, want to avoid detection, want to avoid publicity, want to avoid the spotlight, and this guy was actually seeking it out.
Bachelor number one is a successful photographer who got his start when his father found him in the dark room at the age of 13, fully developed. Between takes, he might find him skydiving or motorcycling.
Serial killers are predators, and yes, they act like an animal that is trying to get his prey, and the rest of the time is trying to blend in so we don't notice him.
He was a real creepy guy, a real idiot.
Jed Mills was bachelor number 2, and nearly 40 years later, he's still haunted by their encounter.
This creep comes up and he puts his face practically in my face and he says, "I always get the girl."
Here is a young lady with a wealth of experience. She once earned a living massaging feet, but she quit when her boss suggested that she work her way up. Cheryl Bradshaw.
Incredibly, he had already served time in prison for sexual assault before he appeared on The Dating Game.
Looking back, it is chilling to realize that this iconic show celebrating love and romance would unknowingly feature a remorseless killer.
Bachelor number 1.
Yes.
What's your best time?
The best time is at nighttime,
Why do you say that?
because that's the only time there is.
The only time? What's wrong with morning, afternoon?
Well, they're okay, but nighttime's when it really gets good. Then you're really ready.
He's saying all of these awfully cheesy things and the audience are laughing along, but that this is a man who's killed.
A bachelor number 1. I am serving you for dinner.
Oh.
What are you called and what do you look like?
Called the banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
In retrospect, it has got to be one of the creepiest moments on TV.
And this is where we start to see how badly the system had failed. Because between being paroled and that airing of The Dating Game, Rodney Alcala had gone on to kill again.
During the time of Son of Sam in 1977, the city was afraid.
During that time, Alcala is taking a lot of photographs.
This was his thing. He was driving around. He was, hey, I'm a photographer. I'd like to take pictures of you. It was a part of his ruse. It was a part of who Rodney Alcala was. It was all about photographs.
Police in New York are on special alert tonight for a psychopathic killer who calls himself Son of Sam.
His favorite targets, young white women with long dark hair.
And a young woman says, "Sure, you can take my photograph."
This is Bill McCreary in North Tarrytown with a story about the discovery of the body of a millionaire's daughter missing for the past 11 months.
Ellen Hover was also the goddaughter of both Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin.
Ellen was strikingly beautiful. She had long dark hair and long, slender arms and legs.
Her father was the owner of Ciro's in Hollywood, where Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin and other people appeared.
On July 13th and 14th was the famous New York City blackout.
This is an ABC News special report.
New York City went totally dark last night.
No refrigeration, no water, no lights on one of the hottest, steamiest nights of the year in New York City.
On July 15th, Ellen Hover goes missing.
I was watching the 11 o'clock news, and there was Ellen's picture. New York heiress missing.
It's in the New York Times. It's on posters. It's on the news.
Ellen Hover had marked on her calendar that she was going to see someone named John Berger on the date that she disappeared.
You're talking about a woman who goes missing in New York City pre-computer. And so Rodney Alcala / John Berger was never really on the radar of the New York City Police Department.
Her body wasn't found until a year later, buried on the grounds of the Phelps Memorial Hospital in Westchester, near the Rockefeller estate.
Right now, the body of Miss Hover is in the medical examiner's office up here, where they're trying to determine if foul play was involved in her death.
I think she was abducted here in Manhattan and ultimately killed up there.
We had a witness who saw somebody who looked like Rodney Alcala at that time period with a woman who looked like Ellen Hover. The man was carrying a camera bag, just like Alcala did.
Ellen's body was so decomposed, police had to use dental records to identify her.
Based on the autopsy, they declared it a homicide.
So Rodney Alcala was eventually questioned by the FBI in relation to the disappearance of Ellen Hover, and he admitted being with her.
Where did you meet Ellen on the 15th? Or did you recall like dropping her off? That was it.
And knowing that he was now officially a serial killer makes the show even creepier. It makes every aspect of it creepier.
One of our edicts was to make the show much sexier and much more provocative than the show in the 60s.
There's one question where she asks the contestants to sound like what a dirty old man would sound like. Ask her out.
I'm a drama teacher, and I'm going to audition each of you for my private class. Bachelor number 1. You're a dirty old man. Take it.
And he makes this growling noise, guttural noise.
Come on, over here.
That once you know who he is and what he's done, just sounds monstrous and eerie.
Oh, honey, we ought to go out and boogie.
And while it might seem bad that he had already attempted to kill one girl and murdered 2 others, during this run, that wasn't all of it. Far from it. He went on a rampage. An absolute horrendous rampage that becomes more and more tragic the more you think of how avoidable it was. And it all started with Jill Barcombe.
Recently, there's been a rash of mass murders.
Jill Barcombe was a 19-year-old girl in New York.
Jill and I were very close as children growing up. We were often mistaken as twins. Jill had a very free spirit about her.
Bruce was very sad when she left New York.
She was young, and it was the 70s, and she was not making the best decisions. She was technically a teenage runaway, I guess you would consider her that.
She left New York for Los Angeles.
She had gotten caught up in the prostitution world.
It was probably with 2 months before she crossed paths with this infamous killer. She was an extremely attractive girl, so I'm sure she caught his eye.
And we believe that he picked her up on Hollywood Boulevard and drive her up into the Franklin Canyon Drive in the Hollywood Hills to a remote area off of a dirt road.
He is absolutely the worst of the worst, no question about it. He's strangling them almost to death and then letting them recover and revive and then doing it again. That's just classical sadism.
Jill Barcombe was found off of Franklin Canyon Road, and it was down the street from Marlon Brando's home at the time.
She has multiple ligatures on her neck. It was a brutal crime scene.
Her face was unrecognizable. Her brother said at the funeral that he couldn't even recognize his sister.
I had night terrors the day that Jill's body arrived. It wasn't just murder, it wasn't just rape, it was brutal, it was sadistic.
Because he lived in the neighborhood where the body was found, Marlon Brando was even questioned by police. Jill Barcombe's murder had a lot of similarities to those of the Hillside Strangler.
They thought perhaps this could be the work of the Hillside Strangler because that's what the Hillside Strangler did.
Because of the Hillside Strangler murders, police were interviewing all the sex offenders in the area, and that included Rodney Alcala. But his luck held up, because police had no idea that they were talking to a man who was guilty of another set of murders.
It complicated this investigation because Jill Barcombe had a friend when she got out to LA that was actually abducted and murdered by the Hillside Strangler.
The next murder the police would come across would show the sadistic nature of Rodney Alcala. Just the lengths and the depravity that this man was willing to go to defied belief.
Georgia Wickstead was 27 years old. She was absolutely gorgeous. She was a nurse that worked for cardiac care.
She was from Los Angeles. She worked out of the Centinela Hospital and just recently moved to Malibu.
Every morning she would pick up another nurse and they would drive to the hospital together to do their shift. And one morning she didn't show up.
So the police were called to do a welfare check of her in her home. It was discovered that her window was open and the screen was removed. When the police entered her home, there was blood everywhere.
The viciousness and the sadism involved in her murder is so disturbing and so profound.
There was a handprint that was found on the brass bedding, but there was no one to match the palm print to. And again, that case went cold.
And Charlotte Lamb is another one that just builds on that depravity.
Charlotte Lamb, in 1978, was a legal secretary living in the Santa Monica area. She had called some friends one night to go out and go dancing in Santa Monica. Her body was later found in El Segundo, miles away, in an apartment complex she had no connection to.
Rodney Alcala was incredibly sadistic to his victims. He would choke them until they'd lose consciousness. And then, when they woke back up, he'd do it again.
She had been strangled, and she'd been brutally raped and murdered. She'd been posed. It's just very disturbing and incredibly sad.
However, soon he would make a mistake. He would get himself caught.
Monique Hoyt was only 15 years old.
He took her up into the mountains under the ruse, which he used more than once, of taking photographs because he was an amateur photographer.
But she was really smart and found a way to bond with Rodney Alcala and gain his confidence.
And he started to cry, which is the only evidence we have that Rodney Alcala ever had any emotion, ever. And that is the one person that managed to talk Rodney Alcala out of murdering her.
He unties her, and then they get in his car, and she waits for her chance to escape. And then it comes. Rodney Alcala's mother feels like a terrible mistake has been made. So she posts his bond. And on March 16th, 1979, he's freed from jail, waiting for his trial that September. So now he's on the streets and able to find more victims.
The Hoyt incident is genuinely one of the most infuriating parts for me of this case, because by this point the police had already given him a free pass essentially twice. And he had already gone on to kill multiple women, multiple young women who had died too early at the hands of this depraved monster. But now they were given this man on a plate, a man who clearly was a danger to society, was still doing the same thing he was paroled for, and was obviously a flight risk. And they gave him bail. They allowed Robin Samsoe to die. It defies logic. It defies any sort of logic. And I understand that the systems back then were different and that the computers back then were different. But all of this could have been avoided so easily. And while on bail for what he did with Hoyt, he would go on to kill again. Not only Robin Samsoe, but Jill Paranto as well.
Jill Paranto was a 21-year-old college student and data entry worker. She lived in an apartment by herself.
On June 13th, she went to a Dodger game and came home and was never heard from again.
When law enforcement entered her home, she was found in her bedroom. Her body was lying next to the bed, very similar to Charlotte Lamb's, where she was laid on her back, fully naked.
So this is, again, another avoidable set of killings by this guy that should have stayed in prison.
Thankfully, one person survived being killed by Rodney Alcala after being alongside him on live television.
We're going to have a great time together, Cheryl.
When I saw that video and I'm watching, I thought, no, she's not going to pick him.
Well, I like bananas, so I'll take one.
Number one. That's your number one. All right.
She has no idea that she has selected a serial killer and that she may be his potential next victim.
She seemed very excited about seeing him. And when he came around, I would say it was a pretty lukewarm togetherness.
Woman who won a date with him ended up backing out, saying she found him creepy.
She called me at the office and she was like, Ellen, I can't go out with this guy. I mean, he is a creep. I'm not going. I can't.
Is that going to be a problem? And of course I said no.
She was smart enough not to ever go on the date with him because, in her words, he creeped her out.
I would be very interested in knowing what happened in the days after when the person who chose him would not date him.
In 1986, the Samsoe retrial would take place, and the families would get another chance to see this man put to death once and for all.
You know, there's only one perpetrator,
that little stone, but the ripples keep going, and there's victims and victims and victims and victims.
6 years after the first verdict, a clean-cut Rodney Alcala was convicted a second time.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Rodney James Alcala, guilty of the crime of felony.
And again, the sentence was death.
Death. That's the only penalty that could ever be rendered in a case such as this.
The second time he was found guilty, and he got the death penalty again, and we were extremely happy.
Now, with a second conviction and a second death sentence, he was prepared to appeal all over again.
One would think that's the end. He's now going to spend the rest of his life on death row until he gets executed. Well, that wasn't the case.
Sadly, the 1986 trial was far from the end of this ordeal for the Samso family.
Because of appeals, as well as problems with witnesses and evidence, there are several trials. This means that Rodney Alcala's victims' families had to hear this horrifying testimony again and again and again.
In 2001, Rodney's death penalty was again overturned.
Twice Alcala has been convicted and sentenced to death. Twice the convictions were reversed on appeal.
The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals felt that the defense didn't give him adequate protection and that they should have gone to the crime scene where the body was discovered, and for that reason it was overturned.
The main reason was an ineffective assistance of counsel claim.
He's now 58 years old, and life behind bars has taken its toll, not only on Rodney Alcala, but also on the victims' families who've been trying to achieve justice.
The Samso family was devastated. Each time it was overturned, I know this after talking to them.
The tough part about that, and what nobody thinks about, is there's a victim's family involved in this.
My mom really kind of lost it then.
We've gone through a lot of hell because of that animal. A lot of hell. A lot of hell. I don't know if you've ever lost a child, but there's nothing that hurts like that. Nothing. Every time this happens, it's like losing Robin all over again. I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. It's one thing even losing a child, but to keep reliving it for 35 years.
We're dealing with a guy who made a career out of working the system. 2 trials, 2 convictions, twice sentenced to death, twice overturned. How do you prepare for a case like this?
When they reversed it, they also removed a substantial amount of evidence. So when it wound up on my desk, we had to basically start from ground zero and work our way up.
In 2010, Rodney Alcala finally met his match. Mike Murphy, the deputy district attorney, would go up against Rodney Alcala in the 2010 retrial of the case. And he wouldn't just bring Robin Samso, he would also find a way to bring the other victims into this and get justice for the families. And being a manipulative, genius IQ serial killer narcissist, Rodney Alcala decided, probably mistakenly so, to represent himself. But this gave us an amazing insight into just what kind of a monster this man was.
Opening statements are underway in the trial, the third trial of accused serial killer Rodney Alcala. The 66-year-old faces first-degree murder charges in the deaths of 4 LA County women and an Orange County girl.
The case went up twice. He was convicted, sentenced to death in California. Rose Bird, who is the old presiding justice of the California Supreme Court, reversed that case, came down. He was retried, went up through the Ninth Circuit. They reversed it again, and then it wound up on my desk with just the Samso murder.
Prosecutors claim DNA appears to link Alcala to the crimes.
And he had that pouch of jewelry that was recovered in the Seattle storage locker, reanalyzed for DNA.
In the 1980s, when these trials were taking place, nobody had ever heard of DNA. Now there had been advancements, which even since that time have been further advanced.
The DNA matched Charlotte Lamb, Jill Parenteau, Georgia Wickstead, and Jill Barkham.
At that point, Rodney Alcala is clearly now known as a serial killer.
In his book, he said that his sister Christine gave him those earrings. 27 years later, we were able to test those earrings, and we got a DNA hit for Charlotte Lamb.
DNA technology was very strong as it pointed to one person and one person only, and that was Rodney Alcala.
We started getting DNA hits in Los Angeles County.
For years, Rodney Alcala was able to game the system, but DNA evidence finally caught up with his crimes, and prosecutors used it against him.
One of the pairs of earrings in there were gold ball earrings that Robin's mother identified as the ones Robin was wearing.
How do you think they ended up in Rodney Alcala's possession?
You mean after he killed my child? After he murdered her? I think he was one of these kind of predators that keeps trophies.
Rodney Alcala was committing murders all over the place in an effort to work the system, in an effort to confuse law enforcement.
In different jurisdictions.
That's right.
Hoping that the law enforcement would never talk to each other.
That's right. And for years, they didn't.
The question was always there and frequently asked by friends and family members. Did they ever find out who George's killer was? 25 years of reliving that terrible time, and always the same answer: no.
One of the many things that hurts me is that that was the last face she saw. And that bothers me because he's so ugly and he's so evil.
We've got to get not only a conviction, but we've got to get a conviction that's going to be upheld on appeal.
I presented evidence that this was taken in San Francisco. 3:15 p.m. on June the 20th, 1979, Robin Samso left Bridget Wilbert's apartment.
He knew the facts cold, and he'd spent 30 years on death row memorizing every single photograph, every single police report, every single detail of the case. By taking the stand, it allowed the door to be open to so many things.
One of the most horrendous parts of the fact that he was representing himself was that this allowed him to interrogate witnesses himself, interrogate testimony himself. And that inevitably meant that he was able to interrogate personally Robin Samso's poor mother, who had already been through, I would say anyone would agree, far more than anyone should. More than her fair share of emotional heartbreak.
Undaunted, Alcala calls Robin's mother as a defense witness.
That was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life, having him ask me questions. I had a hard time really containing myself because he'd look at me and he'd have this grin on his face. It was the most evil thing I've ever seen, you know, and he enjoyed it. He enjoyed every minute of it.
Then there should be some earrings, some pictures with earrings, no testimony from anyone other than Mrs. Frazier that Robin's ears were pierced. None of her friends were aware of that. They were unaware of her wearing earrings.
He expressed relief to his sister that the police didn't know about the storage locker. So what does an innocent man have to hide, number one? So there isn't a single witness that puts Rodney Alcala at knots after 3 o'clock except for Rodney Alcala. He put new carpeting in his car. Who does that? Now, he said he spilled gas in there. Okay. Who does that?
Well, first off, what do you make of this? And the earrings, are they that big of a puzzle piece in this case?
Rodney Alcala is accused in the murder of a 12-year-old girl. And here's his defense. A 1978 YouTube clip from an episode of The Dating Game.
Well, what Mr. Alcala is doing is showing the video that shows the earring from a certain angle, and he claims there's an issue as to whether or not it's one earring or two earrings, and he's trying to say that the video shows him wearing one long earring when in fact it was two earrings. It's actually poppycock bullocks. It's nothing but showmanship in front of the jury. I think is wasting the jury's time.
I forget a lot of things, except the most important thing I can't forget, and that's her and how she died.
Decides he'll represent himself.
He is a narcissist. He has a genius IQ measured by some. So he's very brilliant and thinks that that translates into being able to be a good lawyer for himself in the case.
She'd been gagged with a T-shirt shoved down her mouth.
I wanted the jury to see the level of violence.
So these are the facts, the Samso case.
Because Rodney Alcala was representing himself, he got to cross-examine the witnesses.
Finally, Rodney Alcala would get his day to be the victim for a moment, as Mike Murphy absolutely killed him with his closing argument.
Robin Samso's day in court is today. You make sure that he is held responsible for what happened to that little girl. He got her into his car.
and he drove her up to those mountains. And Rodney Alcala smashed her face in when she was still alive. He brutalized her.
He was rattled after my closing argument. Because that's when he first learned, he wasn't as smart as he thought he was.
What he was doing was he was choking her out, unconscious, barehanded, and allowing her to regain consciousness because he enjoyed that. He gets off on the infliction of pain on other people. And he followed her home. He crawled in her window, and he absolutely brutalized her. Before Rodney Alcala, just like the others, a beautiful young woman. Beautiful. Robin was in the innocent child stage still. She was on the child side of 12. And all she cared about was ballet.
He offered no explanation for the LA cases at all.
The 4 Los Angeles cases is a device for secretly and dishonestly attempting to control the outcome of the unrelated Samso case. Magical thinking.
So magical thinking. Part of what gets that guy off over there, it's not just the conquest and the sneaking around and the rape and the killing and the torture and the sadistic infliction of pain. He wants a free murder. You're going to convict him of the LA cases. He knows that. Everybody knows that. But Robin Samso's day in court is today.
He was blowing kisses at me across the courtroom, and I thought I was going to lose my mind. And I thought I was going to go crazy, And I reached in my purse, and I was going to grab it, and I thought, I can't do this.
You have to come to a conclusion that Robin Samso did have pierced ears.
Are you nervous? Are you angry? Are you afraid?
Nervous and afraid. Just the thought of maybe he could actually win.
The murders he committed, Pat, were brutal. We're talking about using a rock to hit these victims in the head, using the claw end of a hammer to attack as well. Does that tell you that, yes, there are more victims out there?
The DNA also eventually linked them to another victim that they were previously unaware was a victim of Rodney Alcala.
Cornelia Crilly grew up in Queens.
Had long, beautiful Irish hair and Irish eyes, big smile, very friendly and funny.
She wanted to become a TWA stewardess. At that time, they were known as ambassadors to the world. And once she was accepted, she got an apartment with a couple of her stewardess friends on East 83rd Street.
In fact, in the east side of Manhattan, an area becomes known as the Girl Belt because for the first time, young women are living on their own and experiencing their careers.
I had gotten a job in a Brooklyn DA's office. So in the middle of the day, I got a call from her mother saying she couldn't find her. I said, okay, when I leave, I'll go find her. I'm sure she's at the apartment.
When her boyfriend was trying to reach her and was unable, the police came in a horrible scene.
They opened the door. They told me that she had been killed.
She was down on the floor of her New York apartment. She had been strangled with nylon stockings. She'd been raped and brutally murdered.
Well, obviously, the cause of death is strangulation. She's bound, she's held.
We didn't have the forensic tools that we have today. So they did what they could, but it never went anyplace, and the case just went cold, and it stayed cold for 40 years.
The jury had finally returned in the 2010 case of Rodney Alcala, and there was a silence brought throughout the trial as the family sat on tenterhooks.
We begin with breaking news. The jury has made its decision on the fate of convicted killer Rodney Alcala.
The day the verdict was read, the courtroom was very still and very quiet.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Rodney James Alcala, guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree.
The verdict was guilty on all charges, across the board, all 5 murders.
Let me put the death penalty in perspective for you. If you desire to join in the killing of a human being, you and the families of the victims will have to wait at least 15 to 20 years while the case slowly churns through the appellate process.
Remain seated. Court is again in session.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, determine that the penalty to be imposed upon defendant Rodney James Alcala to be death.
Laura, that fate is death. He's heard it again and again and again. Death.
Rodney Alcala absolutely 100% deserves to die for what he did.
In fact, it was one of the quickest deliberations in a death penalty case in Orange County history. It took this jury less than an hour to reach that verdict. Then he also told them that if you give me the death, you are just as guilty of murdering me as anyone else. But apparently the jury did not buy it whatsoever.
It's our third time. I mean, you broke out into applause. You went, I think we said yes, and then three-peat. You said what? Three-peat. It's our third time. This is 36 people now who's all agreed that this man deserves to die. Your feelings any different than the last comment? I'm feeling stronger that because of his own defense, he's eliminated the other procedures that got appealed.
As soon as he admitted that he had been convicted of other crimes and was on death row, his credibility became really hard to be believable.
We wanted to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. What we were doing is we were taking both sides and looking at them the way we were supposed to. We took this very seriously.
I didn't know if I was going to feel excited or if it was just a continuation, but I actually feel like we might be getting some closure now. And Mom, I know she's on her way, but not here yet. Yeah, well, she's on her way. She's totally excited. She's not sure exactly how she feels, but by the time she gets here, you're going to see a happy, smiling person.
It should have stopped with me. And why in the world are there so many other victims when it was a known fact of what he did to me?
I just pray that I live long enough to watch him be executed. I only wish that I could be the one to administrate the injection.
Rodney, I hope you don't sleep at night. I hope you have dreams of us coming after you.
And I hope and believe that he will rot in hell. And actually, I think lethal injection is far too humane for anyone like him. Regardless, I'm waiting for the day for him to die.
If there is a hell, I hope Rodney Alcala burns eternally. I wish he would experience the terror he put his victims through. He is truly a devil. He does not belong on this earth.
Most people who are opposed to the death penalty have never had a reason to use it. Rodney James Alcala is a reason to use the death penalty.
My sister died curled in a ball, beaten, raped, head bashed in with a rock, strangled. There's murder and rape, and there's the unequivocal carnage of a Rodney Alcala-style murder and rape.
Mr. Alcala, I suspect it's a blessing that your mother is not here today to witness this. I feel sure she died with a broken heart.
Not only would he have to answer for those California murders now, the New York district attorneys had also decided to bring him on charges for the 2 confirmed New York murders.
Cold case investigators tonight saying they have solved 2 of New York City's most notorious murders.
Although Alcala is already on death row in California, he will be extradited here to go on trial for killing the 2 New York women.
They decided to charge Rodney with the 2 New York murders.
He conceded that he did kill the 2 women in question.
I was surprised that he pled guilty. I think ultimately he knew he was going to be convicted.
Mr. Alcala got 25 years to life, which is the highest sentence under the law.
He came back to New York in June of 2012, and by December he pled guilty.
It was a surprise. It was a surprise that he pled guilty because he had denied every crime he was ever accused of.
The pleas by Rodney Alcala and today's sentencing brings closure to painful chapters in their lives. From here, Alcala will be transported back to California, where he is on death row after being convicted of 5 murders and 1 attempted murder. Should his sentence there ever be overturned upon appeal, Alcala would be returned to this state to serve out his sentence here.
Even after all of this, after this incredible story, after this monster gets locked away, they are still finding victims from his past.
In '82, this herder out in the middle of nowhere comes across a pile of bones, obviously human remains.
Several initial deputies responded along with detectives, and what they found was it was a body of a 25 to 35-year-old female.
They also found the bones of an unborn child mixed in. They determined that it was a young female and brunette,
They unfortunately weren't able to identify her, and the case went cold.
If you have DNA, you run it. And then you try to find out by sending it down through CODIS and missing persons to find out if you can get a match.
I honestly thought I would be 10, 20 years retired before I'd even receive a phone call saying they had identified her.
I got an email from my son that said, I saw these pictures. Take a look if you'd like.
So in July of 1977, with the permission of his parole officer, he's allowed to travel back to New York. And Rodney Alcala wasn't flying. Rodney Alcala was driving.
The motorcycle was actually owned by Rodney Alcala, and they were able to find that motorcycle in his possession.
In the spring of 1977, Christine was heading to Montana with her boyfriend to pan for gold. And she had big news.
I thought we had enough evidence to possibly charge him, but before we did that, I wanted to speak with him. As we got in there, it was dingy-colored peach in Alcala's medical cell.
It was like something off a horror movie, paint peeling off the walls, flies buzzing around the room. And I remember looking at him going, this is him. I identified myself, read him his rights, and we started pulling out photographs of the original crime scene. He took 2 seconds to look at that photo, and he said, I know that area, that's my area.
This area look familiar? What do you mean by part of your area?
My area is that. It's scary. Talk to me about the picture.
What picture?
Picture that you're pointing at. What's on your mind? Talk to me. Rod, talk. Tell me about that girl. He took his finger and he started tracing her body on the photograph.
That's a guy who wants to relive it again.
Do you know her? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Do you remember taking this picture?
Yes.
Okay. Now the question is, Mr. Alcala, how did she end up dead? Did you kill her? Yes or no, sir?
When it comes to the big question, he's not going to give it to you. But we got him to admit that he was there.
So Rodney Alcala was eventually charged with first-degree murder in Sweetwater County, Wyoming.
How many others are there that, did the same thing Chris did?
I honestly believe in my mind, in my heart, that there's going to be other victims.
I think the hardest part watching all of this unfold for me as a person going back into it was seeing one last tragedy play out. One final heartbreak for the Samso family.
I don't want him to go to no other states and be held accountable for nothing else, because he can only be killed once. I want him to die here. I want to live one day longer than him. I want to live one day without feeling or hearing the name Rodney Alcala in my mind. I could die a happy woman.
In 2019, the state of California placed a moratorium on the death penalty. So that meant that all prisoners on death row, and this included Rodney Alcala, received a stay of execution.
July 23rd, 2019, my mom passed away. She wanted to see that day that Alcala leaves this earth, that he just does not breathe anymore. And it's unfair. It's unfair. Somebody so cruel and evil.
All she wanted was to outlive this monster. But a man who had spent his whole life playing the system had played the system enough to not even grant her that wish. He had taken her daughter, he had taken years of her life fighting for her daughter, and he had even taken away the one last piece of solace that she had fought for. The man was truly a monster, and it is thought that there are far more victims. From the pictures, there are so many more unidentified women that there could be anything from 30 to 130 victims outside of the 8 that were confirmed. That would make him the most notorious serial killer in American history. The way this was treated made no sense to me. I mean, I would traditionally be a person who would be against the death penalty, but I think when you have a clear-cut case like this where DNA has linked him to it. And on top of that, not only has the DNA linked him in the case itself with Robin Samsoe, he also stated the fact that even though he had killed the other 4 women, that doesn't mean he killed Robin Samsoe, essentially admitting to it and then pleading guilty in the New York case. It seems obvious to me that this was a man who just wasn't fit for this world. This wasn't a regular human being, this was an animal. And if a dog bites 1 or 2 people, we normally put them down. This is a dog that should have been put down in 1974 and would have saved so many lives and so much heartache for these families. I jumped into this because I thought it would be a fun story given the movie came out, and I know that sounds a little bit sadistic. No story about a serial killer is fun, but what I mean by that is usually outside of the tragedy, there's an intrigue, there's a kind of a bizarre captivity that we have about watching these people who are far from normal. But this case just became more and more tragic, and it was around one person, Marianne Connolly, Robin Samsoe's mother. The more I thought about the tragedy that she had gone through, the less intriguing this became, and the more tragic it was. The more I just felt like nothing about this was fair. There is no good side to this story. There rarely is in true crime, but normally there's a silver lining to be found. And in this, there's none. Absolutely none.
They asked me, they said, what do you want to say on a plaque? I said, you can say anything you want about Robin, but I don't want his name mentioned on there. He's got no place on that plaque. That's her plaque.
You and I have a history before mine starts.
Who else did you murder, and where are the bodies? That would be my question, is who else is out there, where are they, and please can you give the family some peace? That's what I would say.
And your love is my blood, and your love is my blood. You remind me of why I break my hands. You remind me of why I move my feet. You remind me of why I give a damn. You remind me of the breaking love I need. The breaking love I need. You and I have a history before mine starts. You and I share a heart since mine gave up. And your love is my blood, and your love is my blood. You remind me of why I break my hands. You remind me of why I move my feet. You remind me of why I give a damn. You remind me of the breaking love I need. You remind me of everything poured out. You remind me of my identity. You remind me of why I call this home. You remind me of the breaking